Good evening and thanks for coming. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone to either please turn off your cell phones or turn them to silent. Tonight the Culver Center is pleased to welcome Dr. David B. Woolner, Senior Fellow and Hyde Park Resident Historian of the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute and Associate Professor of History at Marist College. A specialist in Anglo-American relations and U.S. foreign and economic policy under Franklin D. Roosevelt, Dr. Woolner is the co-editor of several books on these topics and has received many honors for his research. Most recently, Dr. Woolner has held the 2010 Fall Fulbright Dow Distinguished Research Chair at the Roosevelt Study Center in Middelburg, Netherlands, where he remains an honorary fellow. He earned his master's and PhD in history from McGill University and a BA summa cum laude in English literature and history from the University of Minnesota. Due to the Simpson and Senator Culver's ties with Henry A. Wallace, we are especially thrilled to have Dr. Woolner shed some light on Wallace's contributions to history. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. David Woolner.
Thank you, Dustin. It's a great pleasure to be here. I thought what I'd do to start is I have a little slideshow that I'm going to show with some music. Where's my assistant? In case the volume needs to go up. We'll give this a try. And I thought we could kind of put us in the mood here for this evening. Should be going.
Sorry.
There we go.
Was empty. Got bored, man. And I said, Paul, what's the matter here? We are waiting on Roosevelt. Waiting on Roosevelt, son. Red was you, light was out. Tell me, mama, what's it all about? We are waiting on Roosevelt. Waiting on Roosevelt, son. Sister's no sick. Doctor won't come. 'Cause we can't pay him the proper sum. We are waiting on Roosevelt. Waiting on Roosevelt, son. waiting on Roosevelt. Waiting on Roosevelt.
Okay, so thank you for letting me do that. This is more, okay. Yeah, I met these guys at the Roosevelt Study Center in Holland. The song you heard, perhaps I should have turned it up a little bit louder, but those are actually all Dutch-speaking Dutchmen singing American folk songs. They put out an incredible CD that they researched, all about songs, mostly about Roosevelt, the Great Depression. It's absolutely extraordinary. And I was so taken with it, I've been trying to play it and to meet these guys. I mean, they did incredible research, including coming to the United States, tracking things down. And it says something about just kind of the global impact, I think, that Roosevelt still has, and the New Deal still has today. Well, we can let that go for a second. First of all, I want to just say that I'm really delighted to be here. I've told some of you that it's kind of special for me to be in Iowa because, like Senator Culver, I was actually born in Rochester, Minnesota. I grew up in Minnesota, not far from here, really. I'm absolutely convinced now that global warming is a reality. I packed, sweaters and scarves, and I brought my gloves and my coat. I didn't believe the weather. I checked the weather, and it's 69 degrees. I thought, no, there's just no way. But it's 80 degrees, so that's amazing. I do want to thank Senator Culver and Simpson College and Mary Sheka for inviting me to be here today. It's really it's been wonderful, and I'm very much pleased to be here. Part of the reason I'm here, of course, is because and what we're going to talk a little bit about tonight, and I'm hoping if I don't go on too long, we'll have some time for questions. And Justin, you just cut me off. But part of the reason we're here is because there's been a real revival of interest in the New Deal and in Franklin Roosevelt and also in Henry Wallace in the last few years. Wallace has enjoyed something of a renaissance thanks to Senator Culver's book and John Hyde's book, which is one of the best biographies I think I've ever read. And I have to say, my family is the Scottish Presbyterian Canadians who grew up on a farm in eastern Canada on a place called Prince Edward Island with this crazy lady who wrote this book called Anna Green Gables, about 8 miles away. It was actually a second cousin of my dad. And there's an awful lot about the Wallace family that rings true for me. And I really appreciated the fact that Senator Culver and John Hyde actually went back to the early years before Henry was born, before Henry was born. I found that absolutely fascinating. The other thing is that as a person who's connected with the Roosevelt Institute, there's been a lot of interest, and we've been getting, particularly when President Obama was elected, I would get calls from the press, and everybody was asking me, is this going to be a new Deal? What's going to happen with President Obama? And so that's an issue that is very much out there right now. And so hopefully tonight we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about that. Before I begin, though, I always like to remind people that if I were President Roosevelt, first of all, none of you would be here yet. The Secret Service would have come in advance. They would have bolted this podium to the floor. The podium would have had kind of side ramps on it so that you wouldn't be able to see my legs. And if you looked at me, you would notice my left hand would always be here like a vice grip, gripping this thing. And I'd be doing this, my friends. And very animated, very jovial, and of course, it was very effective. I mean, look at cartoons. Franklin Roosevelt is jumping over the Grand Canyon, Franklin Roosevelt is running, Franklin Roosevelt is boxing. This man basically lived the entire time in the White House, getting from point A to point B in a wheelchair. And he really couldn't walk properly. I mean, if he was gonna walk, his legs would be bolted in these braces, and really what he was just doing is just throwing the leg forward, which was completely useless. And so you can imagine the courage it took to not only have this paralyzed president lift a paralyzed nation in the Great Depression, but to lead the country under those circumstances and have to be dependent on people for help every day of his life. So it's something I always like to remember before we start talking about Franklin Roosevelt. Am I loud enough? Okay, so if you need me to speak up, just wave in the back, okay? But All right, well, as you saw from the film, the other thing that's important to do is to think about the setting. It's, I think, unimaginable, and this particularly for the young people here today, for the students here today. I don't know if we have our friend from New York. You know, I don't know if you recognize those photographs, but there's two photographs in there of shanty towns in Central Park. That was Central Park, New York. Just absolutely unbelievable. You can see the Plaza Hotel behind the shanty town. So when he took over, when Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Wallace assumed office in March of 1933, the gross national product of the United States had plunged by nearly 70%. The volume of stock transactions had dropped by 60%. The country was reeling by the closure of over 11,000 banks. 29% of all the assets in those banks had basically disappeared. The factories had gone dark and silent. Unemployment rate was at 25% nationwide, and in cities like Detroit and Chicago, it was climbing up to 50%, even sometimes more than 50%. And as some of you may know, the mayor of Chicago sent a note to the White House and said, if you don't send relief, send in troops. There was actual fear of possible revolution. One statistic that I always love to remember is U.S. Steel Corporation in 1929 had 225,000 full-time employees. In 1932, even before Roosevelt got in, they had no full-time employees. They had some part-time, a few, less than 20,000. The state of Georgia shut down its entire school system. They couldn't afford to pay teachers anymore. With the falling economy, there was no local and state revenue tax revenue to pay people. Here in Iowa, in the Midwest, of course, thousands of once prosperous farms met with foreclosure. Farm prices had fallen dramatically. And by the summer of 1932, a year before this, an agrarian revolt had essentially broken out. Initiated, by the way, in part by the Farm Holiday Association, which was based right here in Iowa. One of your professors, Professor Friedrich, I think, would be able to tell us a lot about that. Farmers were trying to stop foreclosures with these penny auctions where they would come and basically overwhelm farm auctions. But they were also occupying courthouses, attacking banks. And in more than one occasion, there was violence. One notable occurrence occurred here in Iowa again on the 3rd of February 1933. The farmers were setting up blockades, trying to block other farmers from taking produce to the markets as a kind of farm strike. And 4 farmers were actually shot by other farmers, which is an incredible thing to think about, and especially here in Iowa. In New York City, in the meantime, 20% of the school children in the New York City school district were suffering from malnutrition. There was a schoolgirl in Albany that died at her desk of starvation in 1933, early 33. So, I mean, it's just an unimaginable state of affairs when you have Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Wallace entering office. It's a crisis that is really shaking the faith of the American people in not only their economic system, but in the institution of democratic government. So what happened? Well, I'm going to kind of go through this quickly, but essentially, as you all know, Franklin Roosevelt pledges himself to this idea of a New Deal for the American people. And he gets into office in March of '33, and it's really quite extraordinary because, you know, the banks across the country have basically collapsed. So the first issue that has to be dealt with is the banking crisis. And so within a matter of hours, and when you listen to his first inaugural, we always remember this line about this, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But the line that actually got the greatest applause was, this nation is calling for action and action now. People were absolutely desperate, and they wanted the government to do something. So when Roosevelt got into office, he, of course, immediately had to deal with the banking crisis, and in order to take care of this, of course, he issued this bank holiday, as you know, great word, bank holiday. And then his officials worked very closely with the Treasury Department officials who were already there in the Hoover administration. I don't want to spend time on it, but Roosevelt refused to cooperate with Hoover, who was trying to fix this banking problem. And so his officials had been working on it. Roosevelt ordered his own New Dealers to get to work on it right away, and they collaborated with the people that were in office under Hoover, and they were able, and they basically worked around the clock for 4 or 5 days. They came up with a piece of banking legislation. They only had one copy, so they took it to the House of Representatives and they read it out loud. There was no copy to pass around. We didn't have Xerox machines. The House would pass it at 4 o'clock, the Senate would pass it at 7 o'clock that evening, and at 8 o'clock that night, President Roosevelt signed it into law. And then on Sunday, March 12th, he did the first of his famous fireside chats. And in this case, what he did was, went on the radio, and he said, "My friends, I want to talk to you tonight about banking." And he explained exactly in very simple language what the government had done. And it's very interesting to look at this because, you know, if you look into and I urge some of you to do that, especially the students here, look into what he said and what the government did, because it's extremely close to what was done under Bush and Obama in that same transition period. This recapitalization of the banks, the stress test, all that, the formula that was used is actually remarkably similar. But the key in this case was to stop people taking their money out of the banks. You know, there were these runs on the banks. So unlike what happened in 2007 and 2008, thanks to the deal, because we had federal deposit insurance, so we did not run to the bank and take it up. But the major banks were in big trouble in 2007, 2008. But in the New Deal case, you had both, you had the banking crisis both from above, but also from below, because people were withdrawing their money. So it all depended really on what people were going to do the next day. And Roosevelt got on the radio on this Sunday night, made this broadcast, and you know, the next day, they really didn't know what was going to happen, because if people continued to withdraw the money when they reopened the banks, the banking crisis would continue. But if they put more money in than they were going to take out, the crisis was over, and that's exactly what happened. It was over like that. We don't have time tonight to go into all of this, but what followed then was an extraordinary period of legislative activity that's never been matched at any time in American history. They would pass 16 major pieces of legislation. Let me give you just a few quick examples. First of all, Henry Wallace for years had been working on this idea of trying to raise agricultural prices through a domestic allotment concept, the idea that you essentially pay farmers to take land out of production to reduce overproduction, to support the price, to keep the price up. And Roosevelt and Wallace would draft this legislation called the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which would be introduced in 100 days. That law was really extraordinary because it contained a number of different provisions and gave Secretary Wallace an extraordinary amount of power to essentially implement that program the way he saw fit. That would be passed in the 100 days, and as a consequence of that, the farm subsidy program would begin, would eventually be declared unconstitutional, but it would be reconstituted later on in the New Deal. Farmers, of course, were in big trouble with their mortgages, so they passed a second law which provided mortgage relief to farmers, and they would pass another law later on in the New Deal that would further that. But again, and this, by the way, helped stop the agrarian violence and unrest in the country from the farming community. They were finally getting some relief. And again, it's just action, action, action. And then you heard about the mortgage crisis, right? Well, some of you may have a mortgage that's underwater. What Roosevelt did was they set up a thing called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. You don't have a mortgage yet, but someday you will. And what do you think the terms will be? What do you want?
I want to make sure that I can still afford everything that I need.
Yeah. So what's a typical mortgage today?
That's a good question.
Well, what's the term of a typical mortgage? It's a 30-year, right? And the goal is to get what kind of a mortgage rate? Lowest possible and fixed, right? Well, that was unheard of in 1933. Okay. So what Roosevelt, this is very typical of the New Deal. This is typical of Wallace. This is typical of Roosevelt, operating on multiple levels all the time. So we had over 50% of all the mortgages, urban mortgages now in the United States, were in default or delinquent, in serious trouble in 1933. 1,000 homes a day are going bankrupt, going into foreclosures. Extraordinarily bad situation. So what the government did was they came along and said, Dustin, you have this mortgage. Dustin's mortgage would be a typical one at the time. It would be 5 to 7 years with a big balloon payment. Dustin's making $17 a year. And when the balloon payment comes, he's toast, he's finished, right? So I say to you, you know what, why don't we do this? I will give you a 30-year fixed mortgage at, at a reasonable rate you can afford, and we'll spread it out over 30 years on an amortized schedule, and that way you can keep your house. And essentially what they did was they revolutionized the mortgage industry and solved the mortgage crisis at the same time. Within 3 years, they refinanced 20% of all the urban mortgages in the United States. The 30-year fixed mortgage became the standard. They also said when Dustin buys his house, he should have somebody go in and look at it and see if it's properly up to snuff. They set up some codes. And believe it or not, so this was now a government program. So the government was actually loaning the money and refinancing Dustin's house. They did this for 3 years. They as I said, they refinanced over 1 million homes. And then in the end, when it came to a conclusion, they actually turned a profit in 1951. Again, it's very, very interesting, very extraordinary, and we don't have time to go into all of these. I'll let some of you ask, but you had securities legislation in 1933 calling for proper disclosure. You had the creation of the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And then, of course, very important, you had the Emergency Banking Act, the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated investment and commercial banking. What is your name, sir?
Elson.
Elson. So Elson wants to be an investment banker. He's going to go nuts on the stock market and risk his money. That's fine. Roosevelt, Wallace, the New Dealers said, that's fine, Elson, you go do that. But please keep your hands off Dustin's mortgage. That's his loan. Don't get your hands on that. And so, you are, Denise, you own a business, right? She owns a business in downtown Des Moines. She has a commercial loan to help the business. You can't touch that. Keep your hands off of it. So the Glass-Steagall Act would last until 1999. I have met Jim Leach a few times. The Graham-Leach Act rescinded the Glass-Steagall. A lot of economists, many economists actually argue that that was probably a mistake. In fact, some of the people involved in it now think it was a mistake because, of course, what happened was once we took away that prohibition, Elson went crazy and he took Dustin's mortgage and everybody else's mortgage and he sliced them up and sold them to people in Zanzibar. All right, so So it's just an extraordinary period to look at in terms of the level of activity. And now, not everything works. And Roosevelt said this. He was very frank about this. He said in the 1932 election campaign, you know, we need to try something. What this country demands is bold, persistent experimentation. Try an idea. If it works, keep it. If it doesn't, throw it out and try something else. And if you look at the New Deal, and I urge you to do that carefully, especially the students here, it's kind of amazing. They're throwing everything but the kitchen sink at this crisis. Some of it doesn't work. Some of it is eventually ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And some of it probably used up energy and resources that might have been better placed elsewhere, frankly. The National Industrial Recovery Act, for example, John Maynard Keynes and others were even writing at the time that Roosevelt should forget reform, he said in 1933. Just prime the economy. You need to get people buying again, and the economy needs stimulus. Of course, eventually Roosevelt was very concerned, and this is where you see Wallace coming in as well. You know, they're both going to focus on the idea of economic security. Economic security, what does that mean? And Roosevelt was very, very interested in this idea, and I'll talk a little bit about it later, maybe tonight. But he was very concerned about a kind of fundamental liberty in the marketplace. And the perception in the early 30s was that the forces of wealth, and in this case he would say the forces of greed, had essentially seized the American economy. Free enterprise, as he said, was no longer free. And people like Denise, who's trying to set up a small business, really didn't have a chance against the forces of these monopolies. So how do you make capitalism work? How do you provide economic security to the average American? And they set up a committee called the Committee on Economic Security. And it was led by the first woman cabinet minister. Her name was Frances Perkins. And Henry Wallace was on that committee. Wallace moved way beyond the issue of agriculture as he got involved in the New Deal. I talked personally to John Kenneth Galbraith about Henry Wallace before Galbraith died, and he told me, and he's been quoted on this, that Galbraith said that Wallace was second only to Roosevelt in importance in the New Deal. He was absolutely great. So you will see then this committee come up with 3 ideas. You're going to like this. One is, you can read the cover letter Frances Perkins wrote to the president, and I have an office actually in Hyde Park at the Presidential Library at the Roosevelt Institute, so I can go up and look at these documents anytime I want. But it's very interesting to read because she said, Mr. President, we've got to get Social Security. We've got to get unemployment insurance. And the third issue they brought up was universal health care. And she said, Mr. President, I'm sorry to tell you this, but that's impossible. Because we should have it. She was all in favor of it. The committee was in favor of it. But she said, it's politically it's a nightmare. You're going to be called a communist, everything else. The American Medical Association was very much against it. And so she said that you're going to have to put that off for another day. Roosevelt did strike a committee to look at health insurance in 1938, but the issue never really got revived. All right, so this is kind of a brief summary. But what I would say is that, and this is very important, and this especially for the young people here, you got to understand that in 1932, 1933, your only contact with the federal government was probably through the post office. There was no there. There was no state. You know, it just didn't exist. So Roosevelt is literally building this sort of from the ground up. And as I said, they're experimenting. A lot of times they were driving blind. And there were an awful lot of young people that came to Washington and academics. This hadn't happened before. Suddenly, you know, all this, it's like the Kennedy administration in the early 60s. All these people coming into Washington to work for the New Deal. Very, very idealistic, very, very excited, hoping to make serious change in the country. So what we see now is where Washington had previously only been a kind of distant regulator of economic and social affairs, it now became the federal government's responsibility to maintain economic prosperity, to mitigate the worst effects of unfettered capitalism, to spread industrial and agricultural development, to impoverish regions of the nation, to guarantee workers' rights to choose their unions, to protect those bargaining rights of those unions, and to conserve and develop the nation's vast natural and, interestingly, and artistic resources. Roosevelt said artists have to eat too. When you come visit me in Rhinebeck, we'll go to the post office that in the middle of World War II Roosevelt designed after a Dutch farmhouse, and you go inside and it's a beautiful mural of the history of Rhinebeck and the Dutchess County region that it's in, that was painted by a WPA artist. I failed to mention one very important piece of legislation, and that's the National Labor Relations Act, which was passed in '35 as part of this, what we call the Second New Deal. And that would sanction in law the right of workers to form unions. This is incredibly important, probably second only to Social Security in terms of its impact on the country. You're going to have enormous growth in trade unionism in the United States, in union membership in the New Deal years. Roosevelt's famous for saying, you know, if I worked in a factory, the first thing I'd do is join the union. Prior to this, again, many of you know this, but prior to this, the state attitude towards organized labor was often hostile, certainly not welcoming. Theodore Roosevelt would be an exception to this, certainly. But when you go back to the 19th century or into the 1920s, the union membership is falling, and you don't have a great deal of sympathy for trade unionism at the national governmental level or at the state level. And this is going to change radically. In fact, in 1945, we would have the highest number of union members in the country historically. And wages, by the way, between 1933 and 1945 would go up by 65%. One last point. There is a kind of, again, I tell my students that I sound like an apologist for Roosevelt often, and I don't really mean to, but there is a lot of distorted history that gets out there nowadays, thanks to all of our news outlets that we have, information or infotainment or whatever they call it. The sort of word on the street is, of course, that the New Deal didn't work, that it was a failure, blah, 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 blah. Well, the truth is that you had an average annual growth rate between 33 and 37 of 11% a year. So GNP was growing at 11% a year. In fact, in 1937, Roosevelt and the aides decided to put the brakes on the economy because they thought it was growing too fast, which ended up causing a recession. But the notion that it wasn't doing anything is just wrong. Now, you can argue about whether it's the right thing to do, that's fine. Or you can argue about whether or not Roosevelt should have done more of the same. A lot of historians and economists say the problem with the New Deal was it didn't do enough. But don't tell me it didn't do anything, because you had a tremendous drop in unemployment from 25% down to 14%, an 11% drop. You had tremendous growth in the economy. So it didn't end the Depression completely, that's true, but it did have an impact. All right, then quickly, the only other thing I want to mention, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about Wallace and Roosevelt's kind of political point of view, is you have to remember that this is an international crisis. And, you know, there are enemies of democracy. And in Europe, you have the rise of fascism, the rise of Nazi Germany. In Japan, you have the rise of militarism in Japan. You have an international crisis that's been spawned by this Great Depression that is, of course, extremely serious. And for Roosevelt's generation, and this is especially true of Henry Wallace, the economic depravity, the poverty that was engendered by the Depression was the primary cause of the Second World War. I cannot stress that enough. I just cannot stress that enough. And so for Wallace and for Roosevelt, winning the war was much more than defeating the Nazis and defeating the Japanese. It was about reordering the world's economic system. And they were serious, very serious. And if you look at what Roosevelt does, what the State Department does, what happens at the Treasury, and what Wallace was advocating, they were largely successful. So from the perspective of Wallace and the perspective of Roosevelt, the internal crisis of the Great Depression, the economic crisis, and the global security crisis were linked. And you can see tremendous articulations of this. Wallace's most famous example, of course, is his Century of the Common Man speech that he gives in 1942. A speech, by the way, which inspired Fanfare for the Common Man by Aaron Culver, which is an incredibly beautiful piece of music, one of my favorite pieces of music. And I think that it speaks to just how inspiring that vision that Wallace had in the early 40s was. So the war was about creating a century for the common man. The war was about extending the New Deal concept around the world. The war was about, as Roosevelt said in 1941, creating a world based on 4 fundamental human freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of every person to worship God in their own way. We sort of expect that, but then Roosevelt adds to it and says freedom from want and freedom from fear. You can't have true peace in the world unless you are able to achieve those as well. And Wallace worked tirelessly for that goal of ridding the world of hunger, ridding the world of poverty became one of his primary concerns. All right, so just to wrap up then, this brings us to today. And we'll just take a quick look. We have our friend. Come on. We have our friend. We know our friend. Here's some images again of the Great Depression. And then, of course, the big question is, what's going to happen today? And, I take credit for this. We were working at the Roosevelt Institute. We were all excited about the election, and we kind of assumed that President Obama would win. And so we had this conference called "Building a New Deal." You know, what is the next president going to do? We thought it would be Obama. And seriously, it was about the New Deal. And the day the conference opened, the very day, this was in New York City. So I'm walking around New York City, you know, and here's the newsstands, and what do I see? You know, hey. Time never offered me a job. I thought they should. Anyway. Okay, so a couple of quick observations. So why not a New Deal under Obama? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, there are a lot of similarities. Both, you know, the Roosevelt administration and the Obama administration are coming at a moment of great economic crisis, no doubt about that. And frankly, Obama came in at a moment of international crisis, not as widespread as President Roosevelt with the spread of fascism around the world, but with the struggles in Afghanistan and Iraq and the struggle against extremist religious ideologies attacking the United States. He had his international crises as well. They also, by the way, I think, came in with enormous expectations. And that is very much a similar characteristic. Both presidents, everybody thought they were going to just change the world. But there are some differences that I think are important to point out. One is the political landscape. You know, it's easy to think, well, Roosevelt had it made because he got this Democratic House, Democratic Senate. He basically had it made. Obama had that for 8 months. And you take Al Franken's problems and what happened in Massachusetts, he really had a very short window of opportunity. But even so, it's not the same comparison, because in the New Deal, you had lots and lots and lots of liberal Republicans, particularly from the Midwest and the West, who supported the New Deal, were big supporters of the New Deal. And frankly, Franklin Roosevelt's biggest problem politically was the Democratic Party. The conservative Democrats were the most difficult for him to deal with, particularly in the South. They were anti-New Deal. They were anti-big government. They were states' rights advocates. They were also, by and large, racist. So he had his hands full with the Democratic Party. So the support that Roosevelt got, which was widespread, you know, overwhelming votes in favor, for example, of Social Security, overwhelming votes in favor of some of the other, especially the early New Deal provisions, came from both the Republican and the Democratic side. And the political debates at the time, and I'm not a political scientist, so you'll correct me, of course, but the political debates at the time were just as intense, but they were divided more on ideological lines in terms of conservative versus liberal, as opposed to Democrat versus Republican. So one senses a greater degree of flexibility, particularly in that first term on the part of Congress in terms of getting support. And by the way, that even includes Republican support for the labor laws, the National Labor Relations Act, which of course would probably not be the case today. Now, President Obama, of course, has had his successes. We should give him his credit for that. So he hasn't been completely unable to move things forward. He did get his stimulus bill through in the initial year. He did get the patient care and patient protection affordable health care act through, and the Wall Street Consumer Protection Act. Those are all significant pieces of legislation. But, and this is more a personal observation, I think the tactics that President Obama used to acquire, particularly on the healthcare side, while you can understand the tactics that he used politically, very quickly became bogged down in partisan debate. So the idea of change under Obama kind of evaporated very quickly because he turned over the leadership of that healthcare law to the Congress, and the Congress was going to fight about it, and did, pretty much along party lines. And for people watching from the outside, Washington didn't look any different, I think, very quickly after Obama assumed office. Now, I know that he probably did that because of the experience that the Clinton administration had in dealing with Congress over the health care bills. I can understand it politically, but I think it had serious consequences. And then there's the last point, and this is where this has to do with the public response to both leaders. And this includes, I would include Wallace into this. If you compare the way that they address the public, there's a big difference. Roosevelt, in many respects, is what Gene Smith called the great divider. You know, I've been doing this, I'm thinking more and more about writing a sort of paper about this, but look at his first inaugural, look at the 35 speeches, you look at 36, and then you jump ahead to the Economic Bill of Rights speech in 1944. He's very concerned about this sort of fundamental constitutional issue of how do you provide economic opportunity to the working man in a capitalistic system. And, you know, and he says things that no president today would dare say. I mean, he's just absolutely strident. If you look at his Madison Square Garden speech, for example, the rulers of the exchange of mankind's good has failed through their own stubbornness, their own incompetence, and have admitted their failure and have advocated. This is his first inaugural. Stripped of the lure of profit by which to induce other people to follow their false leadership, they have resorted to exhortations, pleading tearfully for restored confidence. They only know the rules of a generation of self-seekers. They have no vision, and when there is no vision, the people perish. The money changers have fled from the high seats in the temple of our civilization. We may now restore that temple to its ancient truths, et cetera, et cetera. And he talks about, you know, pleasure doesn't arrive from the acquisition of mere monetary profit. You know, it comes from the joy of creative effort. I mean, he really, and then in 36, I can't read all of this, but I'll read some of it. He's talking about the forces of economic power. He calls them economic royalists. And he says it was natural and perhaps human that the privileged princes of these new economic dynasties thirsting for power reached out for control of government itself, etc. And then he says the consequences of all this. Throughout the nation, opportunity was limited by monopoly. Individual initiative was crushed in the cogs of a great machine. You know, he's thinking about this industrial capitalism, which is a new phenomenon. We're no longer an agrarian society. This is a modern industrial society. The field open for free business was more and more restricted. I love this line. I think this is very powerful. Private enterprise indeed became too private. It became privileged enterprise, not free enterprise. For too many of us, the political equality we once had won was meaningless in the face of economic inequality. A small group had concentrated into their own hands in almost complete control over other people's money, other people's property, other people's labor, other people's lives. For too many of us, life was no longer free, liberty no longer real, men could no longer follow the pursuit of happiness. It's just very powerful stuff. And then, of course, he gives the coup de grace, which I'll just paraphrase it one at a time. But he says, never in the field of American history have a group of people been so united in their hatred for me. He's talking about the economic royalists, and I welcome their hatred. And just imagine, when you're president, you're going to say this. You're going to say, let it be said in my first administration, they met their master, or they met their match. Let it be said in my second administration, they met their match. 100,000 people in Madison Square Garden screaming applause at this. So he didn't pull any punches, and neither did Wallace. Obama's approach is quite different. He, in defending his health care bill, for example, he goes on and talks about the history of the United States, and he talks about Ted Kennedy, and he says things like, one of the unique and wonderful things about America has always been our self-reliance, our rugged individualism, our fierce defense of freedom, and our healthy skepticism of government. And figuring out the appropriate size and role of government has always been a source of rigorous and, yes, sometimes angry debate. That's our history. And then he goes on and he talks about Ted Kennedy and so forth, and he talks about his passion and about his just a fear for his grandchild and so forth. That large-heartedness, that concern and regard for the plight of others is not a partisan feeling. It's not a Republican or a Democratic feeling. It, too, is part of the American character. Our ability to stand in other people's shoes, a recognition that we are all in this together, that when fortune turns against one of us, others are there to lend a helping hand. A belief that in this country, hard work and responsibility should be rewarded by some measure of security and fair play. And an acknowledgement that sometimes government has to step in to help deliver on that promise. I mean, it's a beautiful speech. I love it. But it's quite different because where Roosevelt is appealing to people's emotions, Justin is mad as hell. He's so mad at Emerson for stealing his money, right, his mortgage. President Obama is appealing to our reason. It's a reasoned argument. This side has its points, that side has its points. He does it beautifully, there's no question. But I think, and again, this is more in the realm of my own opinion, it didn't match the mood of the country at the time. The mood of the country when Obama took office was very nervous, very fearful, very angry, very much like the country that Roosevelt inherited in 1933. That's not actually to take anything away from President Obama. I'm just saying that his rhetorical approach and the person that he is didn't quite match, I think, the mood of the country at the time. And I think frankly, I think it has cost him a good deal of support. All right, to close, I want to quote Henry A. a little bit, and then we'll open it up for questions. Henry Wallace was also a person who did pull punches. And if you look at, even after he was dropped by Roosevelt, even after the betrayal that Roosevelt meted out to him in 1944, and we can talk about that and other things about the relationship between the two men, he was very much still carrying the Roosevelt punch. And in 1948, when he was speaking to the Progressive Convention, he was recalling what they went through in this terrible period. At that dark time, you remember, Franklin Roosevelt looked beyond the horizon and gave us a vision of peace, an economic bill of rights, the right to work for every man, for every willing man, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to protection from the fears of old age and sickness, the right to a good education, all the rights which spell security. He was on that committee, for every man, woman, and child from the cradle to the grave. It was a dream that all of us had, and Roosevelt put it into words, and we loved him for it. 2 years later, the war was over, and Franklin Roosevelt was dead. And what followed was the great betrayal. Instead of the dream, we have inherited disillusion. Instead of the promised years of harvest, the years of the locusts are upon us. In Hyde Park, they buried our president, and in Washington, they buried our dreams. One day after Roosevelt died, forgive me for saying this, I'm quoting Wallace, Harry Truman entered the White House. This is the part I apologize for in advance. 46 days later, Herbert Hoover was there. It was a time of comings and goings. Into the government came the ghosts of the Great Depression, the banking house boys, and the oil well diplomats. In marched the generals, and out went the men who had built the TVA, the Grand Coulee, the men who had planned Social Security and built federal housing, the men who had dug the farmer out of the Dust Bowl and the workman out of the sweatshop. A time of comings and goings, the shadow of the past coming in fast, and the lights going out slowly, the exits of the torchbearers of the New Deal. Well, as I said, I would just close with, again, strident words. And I think what we need to remember is that above all, what Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Wallace believed in, frankly, was the power of government. They believed that government was there to serve the general good. And they reminded us time and time again that that was the case. And Roosevelt also reminded us very poignantly, he once said to the American people to never forget that government is ourselves and not an alien power over us. And so with that, I thank you very much. We have time, Mary, for a question or two.
It's later in FDR's, later in his time, he is considering enacting a new Bill of Rights as to what each American should be. Do you think that had any immediate impact, or has it had any impact on how we do how politicians go about individual athlete terms?
Do I think it has any?
Do you think it's impacted the American political thought?
After it was articulated? Yeah, I think so, absolutely. Roosevelt, the question was about the Economic Bill of Rights and whether it had any long-term impact. It's very interesting. I think there are two things I would say that Roosevelt is starting to reflect. One was over the election in 1940 when he decided that he knew he was going to have to go to war, and he needed Henry Wallace to keep the New Deal alive, which is why he picked him to be his vice president. And he actually told Sam Rosamond that he might drop dead if he fell in his position, and he had to think about the future of the New Deal. And he wanted Wallace there because he trusted Wallace to keep it alive. Of course, that makes the 1944 decision all the more tragic. Personally, I think that Roosevelt was just completely exhausted in 1944. And that played a role in his unwillingness to fight for Wallace. But he's also thinking at the end of the war about rekindling the New Deal and going back to those basic issues. And what he's really asking, is how do you make capitalism work? He's accused, of course, of being a communist. I would argue that what Roosevelt was dedicated to doing was saving liberal capitalist democracy. That's what he was trying to do in the 1930s. But to do that, he also said people who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff with which dictatorships are made. So you have to put it in the context of the time. This is 1944. We just fought a very long war against fascism, which he thought had economic causes. So we don't want to go through that again. And to prevent that, and Wallace definitely believed this as well, to prevent that sort of thing, you need to provide people in a free market system basic economic security. And so he created this list that he thought we should strive for, including universal health care, and things like the right to a good education, the right to housing, this sort of thing. It doesn't mean the government's going to buy you a house, but how does, when you have programs that facilitate these sorts of things, government should play a role in serving the general good, as Wallace also believed. So, and I think it definitely had an impact on the post-45 generation. Sure.
I would like to go back to your comparison of Obama and FDR. In solving the 2008 crisis, President Obama was renowned for gathering an economic advisory council that was very much diverse, like they didn't really agree with each other. You mentioned that council that Henry Wallace was agreeing with FDR's attack. Did he have the same approach of gathering different minds together, or was it more of like a like-minded people?
No, Roosevelt's administration was the most eclectic you can possibly imagine, much more so than President Obama. And even in the same department, when you look at Henry Wallace, for example, and George Peake, they hated each other, and Roosevelt knew it. And he seemed to take sort of kind of pleasure in putting these together. And Cordell Hull, the only man who hated George Peake more than Henry Wallace was Cordell Hull. So when Wallace finally comes to Roosevelt and says, I can't stand it, either Peake goes or I go. And Roosevelt laughed. He goes, I got just the job for him. I'm going to send him over to Cordell Hull's department and make him the head of the foreign trade. And he said, Cordell will love that. And he burst out laughing. So no, he cultivated controversy, much more so, I think. And people from abroad in particular, I do Anglo-American relations, the British officials were like, this is a madhouse. So there was a lot of that in the New Deal, but it was a period of tremendous creativity, tremendous energy, and a lot of different ideas coming together. Sure.
In the comparison between Obama and Roosevelt, I thought one thing that's occurred to me is Obama came in just as recession was starting. So when it took a while for everything to start working, they were saying, well, it really didn't work anyway. And with Roosevelt, it's been over 2 years, and so the country, the old way, the Republican way, had totally failed.
Well, that's true. That is true to a certain extent, but actually the depth of the Great Depression is exactly more or less right when Roosevelt comes in. That is the absolute rock bottom. And in fact, it's 32 that it really begins to fall. So it hadn't been around. You had kind of recession in 1930 and a lot of economic uncertainty. It got a little worse in 31, and then it really went down in 32. But you're right. So it's a different circumstance. By the way, I think that the transition between President Bush and President Obama was probably the best President transition in U.S. history. There's extraordinary cooperation between the Bush administration and Obama. Both administrations deserve tremendous credit for that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it came in at a different time, and the economy still had a ways to go down before his program was going to start to kick in, whereas I think Roosevelt, it was already at the bottom. Yeah. Other questions? Sure.
Could you talk just a little bit about why Roosevelt acquiesced in or participated in jettisoning Wallace? I mean, it's great, one level of great tragedy is, of course, had he not done that, Wallace would have president of the United States.
That's one of the greatest what-if questions you could possibly ask. I mean, Henry Wallace was easily 30, if not 40 years ahead of his time. And this was an extraordinary man, calling for civil rights, calling for things that people just, and he wasn't, he wasn't afraid to call a spade, and he wasn't afraid to talk to anyone. He was a man of great intellectual curiosity. As far as Franklin Roosevelt is, he's a master politician, and politicians use people. I mean, that's what they do. And he was first, he's a great leader. I'm a tremendous admirer of Franklin Roosevelt, but in political machinations, they play these political games, and there was tremendous pressure put on Roosevelt to drop Wallace. Now, technically speaking, Roosevelt never, he never publicly did that, but he didn't really support Wallace. He publicly said, if I were a delegate, I would vote for Wallace. But I think it's a combination of things. I do think Franklin Roosevelt was exhausted. He was exhausted by the war. I think he was exhausted by the idea of running again. He didn't really campaign. Basically, he gave one speech, the following speech, and he probably won the election. We got to look that up. The first dog who won the presidency. But I think he was really exhausted, and he didn't want to put up the fight. He just didn't have the energy to put up the political fight to preserve Wallace, and he sort of left it to fate. And he didn't do anything when it turned against Wallace, which was orchestrated by the party bosses. He didn't do anything to stop it. He did, though, and it's interesting, he had an idea of what Wallace would do afterwards. And it was actually quite a creative idea from the Secretary of Commerce at that moment when, in 1944, when you're trying to reintroduce Roosevelt was also torn. I mean, I really do think he was torn by this, but, yeah, I think he was exhausted and he didn't want to fight, and as a politician, he was being told, you have to get rid of this guy, he's gonna cost you votes. He's not the right person at this time, and he just didn't fight it. Sure.
I love the what if game. So if one of the most powerful things I had heard at one point was while I was in New York City, somebody sort of just listed out, this was at one of those conferences, somebody just sort of listed out what New York would not have if the New Deal hadn't taken place, right? Can you talk a little bit about what Henry Wallace meant for the Midwest? What kinds of things have we gained from his place in the New Deal?
Well, I mean, the Department of Agriculture under Henry Wallace became the largest governmental agency in the United States. It went from 40,000 employees to 140,000 employees. It's also the best run agency in Washington, even though in spite of its size. We also forget, maybe you don't forget here in the Midwest, but you know, where I am now in New York, they certainly forgotten or never knew that in the 1930s, 25 to 30% of the U.S. economy was directly tied to agriculture, and a huge issue. In fact, the banking crisis is very much precipitated by the crisis in agriculture, which predates the crash of 1929. We didn't have the crash of 29 is a consequence, it's not the cause. It's one of the things that happens in the 20s that are indicative of the fact that the U.S. economy is structurally flawed. There's a maldistribution of wealth. Dustin can't make enough money to buy all the goods that the American economy can produce. The workers are not paid enough, et cetera. So there were these inequities in the U.S. economy. There was huge crisis in the farm community, and actually already a depression in the farming sector by 1926, 27. So, and the economic analysis of this was that you weren't going to get a full recovery, full industrial recovery or urban recovery if you didn't get a recovery of the agricultural sector. So Wallace was critical. I mean, the second bill that was passed in the 100 days or that's introduced, not necessarily passed, but introduced, is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Is absolutely critical. And so Wallace is, really largely responsible for implementing this program and getting this piece of legislation passed that allowed the domestic allotment program to go ahead, which actually did raise agricultural prices, and combine that with the inflationary policies. You reverse the downward spiral in the agricultural sector. That's a huge achievement. And it's not something you can see. It's not a bridge like the Triborough Bridge or the Lincoln Tunnel or Skyline Drive or FDR Drive or every other thing in New York City that was built in the WPA or the PWA. But it was a vitally important component of the recovery that took place in the 1930s. So, and it was a recovery. I mean, I can't stress that enough. I'm of the school that says, we should have done more. For me, World War II is the New Deal on steroids. Okay? And you want to see domestic stimulus, look at World War II. And by the way, we went into massive debt, and after World War II, you had the largest period of economic expansion in world history, not just U.S. history. So, the sky's falling mentality about the debt that we're in right now. I'm not saying debt is a good thing, but there are times when you do need to stimulate the economy, I think, and World War II really wiped out the economic problems that were there. Sure.
When you, at the end of your presentation, you compared the temperament or personality of President Obama with that of FDR, said that he didn't, facts were similar, but he went another route that you thought to his detriment. Is that because of personality? Is that because of political consultants, or why is that?
You mean why is it that what?
That Obama didn't do what Roosevelt did, and that's...
well, this again is an opinion, so I can't. But when I look at it, I think a couple of things. I think that, Roosevelt, it's so consistent. You go to the first inaugural address, you go to the speeches in the 30s and mid-30s, and you ago, he's identified who caused the problem. And he's pointing his finger at them. You can call it class warfare or whatever, but he says these greedy people brought the country to economic ruin. And he believes that. And it's probably right? So if Emerson brought the country to he brought the country to ruin, we got to make some rules, we got to, but there's anger and fear in the country, and he's saying, we're not going to go back to this anymore. We're going to solve it. Then you had the Procure Commission, in the 30s. So people were really worked up about this. And he responded to that angst and to that anger. President Obama, that's not the kind of person he is. He's a community organizer. The person who wants to bring people together. It's kind of what's bred in the bone. He wants to bring people together. He appeals to people's reason. It's kind of sad, but these are beautiful speeches. But unfortunately, that he tries to be angry. He gets up in the, I remember that time he was on the White House lawn, and early in his administration, remember, and the bankers had just gotten another gazillion-dollar bonus, and he goes, I'm angry. It wasn't really, didn't quite do it. It wasn't like saying, never in the history of this, they got their match, now they're going to beat their master. There's a little bit of a disconnect, and I think that has a lot to do with the rise of the kind of populist right-wing movement, the Tea Party movement, and things, and also you see the rise of Occupy Wall Street. It's like nobody's listening at the top to this anxiety, this fear. Whereas Roosevelt was right there. He understood the public movement. By the way, that's not to say that Roosevelt didn't compromise with business, because at times he did. But in terms of his appeal to the American people, he said, this is a great line, he said, in that same 36 speech, hammering away about the economic royalists, economic dynasties, they want this, they want that, they clothe, and he said they wrap themselves in the Constitution, they wrap themselves in the front. And he said, against economic tyranny such as this, the American citizen could only turn to the organized power of government. I mean, that's the New Deal to me. That's what it's all about. That's the fundamental belief to use government to fix the general good. It's really not a left wing or a right wing. It's more on the progressive side, no question. But that was really what was animated.
That seems like a nice place to wrap up, David. I want to thank you again for being here tonight. Thank you.